Okay, we'll make a start. So I want to say welcome to everybody who's joining us. This is our last talk of our whole Antarctica Week Festival, and it's been a fantastic week. So I hope that some of you have been able to join some of our other talks. If you haven't, then if you've missed any, they're all recorded and they'll be available on the thwaitesglacier.org website. So you've got time to go and revisit any of the talks as many times as you want in your own time. So for our last talk, last of 10 today, we've got Anne Beaulaurier from the United States Antarctic Program with us. She lives in Alaska near Denali National Park. And so she's also used to being in the cold in the Northern Hemisphere as well as the Southern Hemisphere. And prior to working for the United States Antarctic Program, she ran naturalist programs and logistics for a travel company operating inside that national park. And spent the last 6 austral summers helping to run and manage field camps on the ice for visiting researchers, including West Antarctic, the Transantarctic Mountains, and the McMurdo dry valleys. So she's got lots of experience and fun things to tell us, I'm sure. She's going to talk for about, Anne will talk for about 30 minutes today, and then we'll have the Q&A session afterwards. So please put questions if you have them in the Q&A function at the bottom. It should be at the bottom of your screen. We'll try and get through as many as we can. And remember, if you do want to, want us to give you a shout out from where you are, joining us from today, just, put your name or your location or your school in there with us, and then we can read it out for you. So, Anne, we'll look forward to hearing your talk.
Okay, great. Thank you, Sarah, for the introduction. I am thrilled to be participating in Antarctica Week Festival and showcasing the international Thwaites Glacier collaboration, and to be able to speak with you all wherever you are all around the world. What a cool way to get into your living rooms and your classrooms and talk to you a little bit about what it's like to run a field camp on a remote glacier to support scientific research. So again, my name is Anne, and I think I have one of the coolest jobs in the world, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about it today. I run, as I said, field camps in Antarctica for the purpose of research, like the important work that's being done down around the Thwaites Glacier. So come with me, I'll show you how we do it. So let's get oriented first. As Sarah mentioned, I live in the Northern Hemisphere. I live in the subarctic, and so that's by the northern part of our globe. But I'm pretty surprised how often people think that I go to the North Pole when I say that I go to Antarctica. So just to be clear, if you go to the northernmost part of our globe, you'll get up to the Arctic. And likewise, if you go to the southernmost part, you'll get down to Antarctica, that white ice and snow covered continent at the bottom part of the Earth. But you probably already knew that, right? All right. So my work in Antarctica begins at McMurdo Station. This is the largest American scientific research station. You can see it there. Well, actually, my journey begins thousands of miles before that. So it starts by a flight from Alaska to California, then from California to New Zealand. From New Zealand, I fly to McMurdo Station in a C-17, like the one shown here, a huge Air Force jet. All these steps can take anywhere from a few days to a few weeks. It really just depends on the weather in Antarctica. I've had it take as long as 3 weeks before, from home down to what we call the ice, Antarctica. McMurdo, while called a research station, is a lot more like a town along the coastline. This is what it looks like. It's a small town of about 1,000 people in the summertime and about 200 people or so in the wintertime. It's actually bigger than the town that I live in at home. So for me, it's kind of a big town, but it's really different in that no one actually lives there full time. So people come down there to work, either to do research or to be on the supporting side of making that research happen. So what season do you think it is in Antarctica right now? Yeah, it's summertime. So the population is a little bit bigger during the summertime. Now this map shows the field camps located throughout Antarctica, the American British run field camps. They are the green dots, and while the research stations like McMurdo are inhabited year-round, the field camps are temporary. They're only inhabited in the Antarctic summer season. Once you leave McMurdo, it's a really vast, unpeopled wilderness, and this is what it looks like in most places. It's a little bit like being out in the middle of the ocean with nothing surrounding you except in Antarctica, instead of being on the water, we're on frozen ground. We're on ice and snow. It can be pretty intimidating. And you know what? There's no gas or petrol stations. There are no restaurants or supermarkets, and there's no hotels. And it's just, we call it the flat white. It's just vast, wide open ice and snow. And that's where the field camps come in. We set up field camps out in this white wilderness to, we set them up for a few months so that scientists can come and do research. It serves as a hotel, a cafeteria, a gas station, and an airport. The first people that arrive at a location will set up the large yellow tents that you see in this upper slide here. They're called rack tents, and they have heaters and electricity that's generated either by solar power or diesel generators. And these large camps will have cooks and mechanics and other people to ensure that everything runs smoothly. We can have maybe as many as up to 100 people at a field camp. People will sleep in unheated tents like the ones you see in the bottom down here. They're unheated, they're right on the snow, and they're kind of your bedroom, home away from home, or your hotel room. We use outhouses for toilets, and once the camp is all established and set up, then the scientists can begin to arrive. This is what a finished field camp might look like. We have some big tents to work in, and then there's smaller tents to sleep in. Our goal is to make it easy for scientists to come out in the field and then just focus on their research. We take care of the nitty-gritty details of just being able to live in Antarctica. So you may have heard of the Thwaites Glacier, especially if you've watched any of the other talks this week. Maybe you've heard some of the scientists talk about the work they're doing there. It's a massive glacier that is melting rapidly, so there's a lot of interest to go there and study it. It's almost 1,000 miles or 1,600 kilometers from McMurdo Station to the Thwaites. That's a long way. And keep in mind, Antarctica is about the size of the United States. So you're traveling a good ways into the continent. Before scientists can go there, my team needs to get there first and get everything ready for them. So we usually spend a couple of weeks in McMurdo Station packing and practicing our survival skills because we're going to be out there on our own. When we pack boxes of supplies in McMurdo before we go, it's not glamorous, but we have to make sure that we label everything so carefully so we know exactly what's in each box and which boxes to open first, which boxes to bring with us on our very first flights. We have to be pretty meticulous. So when it's finally time to go, we'll fly on airplanes. So to get to field camps located in the middle of nowhere in Antarctica, people fly in airplanes that have skis. You can see the skis on the bottom of this airplane here. There's a few different kinds of skied aircraft. So this is the biggest kind. This is the biggest skied aircraft. It is called a Hercules or a Herc for short. They can hold up to around 20 people and quite a few supplies. We also have smaller airplanes with skis like this one here. It's called a Twin Otter. These can hold just a few people and not many supplies. When we are the first to fly into a field camp location, we usually fly in one of these planes because they can land almost anywhere on the snow without a groomed skiway or a runway, and I'll talk a little bit about what that means. here in a little bit. We also have what's called a Basler, which is this larger plane here. It's smaller than a herc, but bigger than a twin otter. So when we are the first people to land at a field site, we have a lot of work to do. But our first priority always is to stay safe, because Antarctica is the driest, the coldest, the windiest, and the emptiest place on Earth. So we take a lot of precautions to make sure that each person who's out there knows not only how to take care of themselves, but also the others that they're out there with. It's harsh conditions, and we have to be our own first responders because we're so far away from civilization. So the best way to deal with an emergency is to not have an emergency. We have a phrase that I like to use a lot down there, which is slow is smooth and smooth is fast. So we're very careful to not rush, not take on any more risks than are necessary, and to make sure that we're constantly making sure we're warm enough and safe. And to be safe, you know, the advanced team arrives usually on one of those twin otter airplanes with survival supplies like some tents, food, fuel, and maybe a snowmobile. One of the safety rules in Antarctica is that before a plane can drop you off and then leave you in the field, you have to set up a shelter, like a tent. You have to get a stove going to make food, melt snow for water, and to be able to maybe generate a little heat. And you have to be able to make contact with McMurdo Station. Once you've accomplished these three things, then you can tell the plane it's safe for them to leave, and they will head back to McMurdo. You're truly on your own at that point. You have to be very self-sufficient. So here you can see we're setting up our first tent, getting a Coleman stove hooked up. So this means that the plane is still on the ground at this point. But once we've accomplished all that, the plane leaves, and then there is another important tent to set up. It's the next thing we do. What do you think it's going to be used for? Here's a hint. Have you ever used an outhouse in a park where there's no flush toilet, but just a hole that you pee and poop in? Well, that's what Shannon is setting up here. She's putting together the toilet that you sit on. Voila, here's the toilet tent. We keep lots of rolls of toilet paper handy, and we have hand sanitizer to use when you're finished. And yeah, sometimes it can be a little chilly sitting on the toilet, but the toilet seat is made of foam, which is warmer to sit on than plastic. So you have that going for you. After the setting up the toilet tent, one of the other really important tents to set up is the kitchen tent. This is going to be our temporary kitchen. We'll use it until we get a bigger one put up a few days later. It's also our emergency shelter. If we had to, we could sleep in here. It would be like a slumber party, but probably not nearly as much fun. We would probably only sleep in here if there was a really big, scary storm outside. We use a camp stove to melt snow for water and to cook food on. It works well when the camp is still small and just a handful of the first people setting everything up. But in order to support more than 12 or 15 people, we'll really need a bigger kitchen. Here Stacy is on one of the first nights at camp, having fun as she cooks a meal for camp. You can see the pretty rudimentary kitchen setup here. The floor looks like a waterbed because it's just right on the snow. There's boxes of food that came on the airplane with us, a water cooler for storing the water that we've melted from the snow. It's a pretty simple but really functional setup. As an advanced team, we'll begin setting up the field camp. One of the first jobs after setting up the first couple of tents is to take on grooming the skiway so that the larger herc planes can arrive with more people and, importantly, more supplies. Grooming involves smoothing and packing down the snow in a 2-mile-long skiway, or a 2-mile-long runway that's called a skiway on the snow. Once the larger planes can land and bring in more supplies, we'll focus on erecting what we call the camp buildings, really just bigger tents. We'll hook up electricity and we'll get ready for the scientists. But it's pretty cool to see a groomed skiway from the air. So that's what you're seeing in this photo here. And you can see the vast flat white all around it. Sometimes we leave tractors out over the winter so we can use them again the following year. When we return to the location, they're covered in snowdrifts and pretty buried. But these tractors are really important to us. They'll help us groom the skiway, move heavy supplies, and more. Since we knew we were going to be studying the Thwaites Glacier for several years, we left some equipment out over the winter to use year after year. So this photo was taken from an airplane as it was flying over the Caterpillar tractors parked, partially buried under the snowdrifts. So the plane lands, we set up our first couple of tents, and then we get to grab shovels and begin digging the tractors out. We also leave snowmobiles in the field sometimes. So this is my friend James. He's trying to start a snowmobile that sat outside all winter with the heavy equipment and was covered with snow. When a machine sits for 9 months in really cold conditions, it can take quite a while before we get them running, but they're incredibly important tools to us. So we make sure to keep them in really good shape so that they will start up with a little bit of effort. Sometimes we make these giant snow piles called berms, and we store things over winter on them so they won't be completely buried in snow the next year when we come back. We have to be sure not to lose things in the snow. This is especially a challenge in the Thwaites Glacier region because it gets a lot of snow annually. This is what that same stuff will look like after a winter of snow and wind in the West Antarctic. Do you see how we put tall flags around it so we can find stuff under the snow? The flags really help us find things in deep snow. So if the tops of these fuel bladders were covered, we would still know they were there because of the flags. And there's different colored flags to represent different things. So these flags are, they're blue and they tell us that there's fuel nearby. These brown things that you can see here are fuel bladders, and they can store up to 10,000 gallons of fuel in each one. And it's important that we have blue flags there to tell us it's fuel so that we know to hand shovel around them rather than using one of those big tractors that could puncture them. To work in Antarctica, we do a lot of shoveling. It's maybe the thing we do the most, lots of it. And sometimes we will use the heavy equipment to help with the digging. Sometimes it's just too much to do by hand. Whoops. We rely so much on these tractors and snowmobiles that there's always lots of work for our mechanics to do to keep everything working, especially in those freezing cold temperatures where it's really easy for things to break. So we've talked a bit about setting up the common tents and then getting the equipment running and grooming the skiway. We will also set up sleeping tents for ourselves and sometimes for other people. It's often a team effort to get them set up. When you sleep in a tent on the snow in Antarctica, the temperature inside will mostly be below freezing. However, sometimes when it's not too windy or too cloudy, the sun will heat up the tent and bring it above freezing on the inside, if you can believe it. Our sun never sets in an Antarctic summer. It just circles above the horizon. So there's a lot of solar gain, which can heat up your tent. But again, if it's cloudy, there isn't enough warmth from the sun to heat up the tent very much. And as you probably know, Antarctica is pretty famous for its inhospitable weather. So in the flat white, there's nothing to break the wind for hundreds or even thousands of miles. So there's no trees, there's no buildings, nothing to block the wind, and it can be pretty relentless. We also, to combat the wind, have to make sure that we anchor the tents down really well so they don't blow away. We get big storms, and not only do we have to make sure that we tie the tents down really well when we set them up, but we have to check them all the time to make sure that they haven't loosened up. We also examine the quality of the tents, make sure they don't have any rips that could lead to a big blowout. We've had to take tents down in the midst of the storm when they've developed a rip that would threaten to just rip up the whole tent and blow everything away. When there's really strong winds, it'll pick up snow and create what's called a whiteout, where it's really difficult to see or even impossible to see just a few feet in front of you. So we set up hand lines to help people get from their sleeping tent to the main buildings if a storm gets really bad. They can just walk over to, they know which direction to go from their tent. They can walk over until they hit this flag line with rope, grab onto the rope and walk following the rope, and it will lead them right to the kitchen tent where they can be safe. This is a picture of my sleeping bag. Generally, we think of sleeping bags as being for people, but they can keep a lot more than just people from freezing in Antarctica. This is what I sleep with in my sleeping bag for the first few nights until we have bigger heated tents up. So I might have my computer, a Kindle, phone or camera, water bottles, sunscreen, liquids like contact solution or medicines, foods that can't freeze. Maybe I brought an apple and a tomato from McMurdo, maybe even some cheese. We get to eat a lot of cheese in Antarctica, but when cheese has been frozen, it becomes crumbly. So sometimes it's nice to have one piece of cheese that is still creamy. We also put damp socks and gloves in our sleeping bag to dry them out overnight. It can be a little uncomfortable to have so many things in bed with you, but there's always, you always know that eventually a heated structure will go up, and there's lots of incentive to do so that you can empty out your sleeping bag and have a warm place to store things. And usually that happens after just a couple of days. Think about what you might want to keep warm in your sleeping bag if you were out there camping with me. Pictured here are gas generators. They produce electricity so we can plug in our laptops and charge our radios and other communication equipment. When the camp gets bigger, we'll use much bigger generators as well. And then there's a box around them, and that's to ensure that no gasoline spills on the snow. We're extremely careful to make sure that we leave the environment as clean as when we arrived. Eventually, we put up the larger tents called the rack tents. They can be used as office space or a larger kitchen area. You can see that there's a chimney coming out of this tent here, and that's where there's the heater. So there's an oil heater there. These tents inside can actually be pretty cozy. So this is a field camp kitchen, or what we call the galley. It has electricity and a stove and an oven, so we can bake bread, cakes, roast meat, make cookies. It's much better set up to feed a crowd than the tents that we use early on. It's heated inside, has tables and chairs, and just like grandma's, there's always plenty of treats. When you work outside in the cold all day, you burn a lot more calories than if you were sitting inside. So people at field camps are always hungry. We have cooks on site. They're really good, and they make sure there's always plenty of delicious food. Fresh baked bread when you've been working outside in the cold all day is pretty amazing, especially when you can smell it outside. So the cooks make all the delicious food, and then everybody takes turns helping do dishes and cleaning up after a meal. We call it house mouse, the chores that everyone around camps help out with. I even started using the term house mouse at home because it makes doing dishes and cleaning up a lot more fun, especially when you're doing it with your friends. It takes a lot of water for cooking, washing, and drinking. How many gallons of water do you think you go through in your home every day? The average American uses 80 to 100 gallons per day. What are they doing with all that water? We don't use anywhere close to that at a field camp. We actively work to conserve water because we have to make all of it by melting snow. This is a snow melter. You can see me loading clean snow into the heater. It melts it and then pumps water into the tent. It's a ton of work. And so everybody around camp has to take turns putting snow in there. Here I am in my office. Pretty fancy, huh? Working as a camp manager, my job is to make sure that everything around camp is working smoothly. It's a little bit like being a school principal. The principal has to make sure that teachers have what they need to teach and that custodians know about what needs to be worked on or cleaned up, and that the cafeteria people have what they need to cook the food. I make sure all the cooks, the mechanics, the scientists are all okay, and if they need something, they'll come and ask me for help. I also talk to people back in McMurdo to learn when the next airplane will be arriving, what and who will be on it, and if they need anything from us. Here's another office setup. It's not luxurious, but just like other offices, you can see there's a computer, there's a printer, and then we have radios, communication devices, there's whiteboards and bulletin boards and paper. So what else do you need? They're definitely not luxurious, but they work. We have everything we need. We don't have regular telephones. We don't have cell phones. There's no cell phone towers in Antarctica. But we do have another type of phone called a satellite phone. And we use that to check in every day with people back in McMurdo to let them know we're okay. We have a designated check-in time. And if we don't call in by that time, people in McMurdo might assume that something bad has happened to us. So we make sure to check in every day, let them know we're fine so that they don't prepare a search and rescue to come and look for us. It's good to know though, if we didn't call in because something bad was going on, they would come and make sure we're fine. I also talk on the radio to the pilots who are coming to let them know what our weather is like and if it's safe for them to land. Since we're basically running an airport out in the vast wilderness of Antarctica, we have to always be aware of the weather conditions. So we have special instruments that help us understand our weather, and then we can relay that information to help weather forecasters. Did you know there's weather forecasts in Antarctica? Some of our supplies are brought to by a traverse. A traverse is a parade of tractors pulling sleds filled with supplies. It's an excellent way to get huge machinery, large quantities of fuel, and heavy supplies to faraway locations. So this is the Bass Traverse bringing supplies to the field camp to support all of the research at Thwaites Glacier. 2 of these tractors are pulling rubber containers filled with diesel fuel. 1 tractor is pulling a bunch of snowmobiles, and another one is pulling supplies and containers that are where the drivers of the tractors eat and sleep while they travel several days to their destination. It's kind of like a giant snail that's pulling its own home behind it. In many ways, the traverses are the long haul truckers of Antarctica. So they move goods long distances across the snow. It's pretty cool. Here's a closer view of a load of fuel and fuel bladders. A plane has even landed near them to fill up. So it's a mobile gas station on its way to the field camp. So after several weeks of really hard work, the field camp is finally ready. It's all set up, the skiway's groomed, the buildings are up, the sleeping tents are up, and the scientists can come in and get to work. In they come on the Hercs, along with their research supplies and fuel. The Hercs also pick up supplies from the field camp that we don't need anymore and our trash. And people that are done, and they fly them back to McMurdo. The goal of each Herc that comes in is to arrive and leave on the same day. They only overnight if they have a repair that they need to do or weather changed. So they'll fly in, drop things off, pick things up, and fly back out. It's always an exciting day in camp when a Herc comes in. Sometimes we'll even get up to 3 in one day. A true airport. Did you know a tractor can fly inside of a Herc? These planes are really helpful for field camps because they can carry super heavy loads. We use big hoses to receive hundreds, even thousands of gallons of fuel from the plane. And we can use those hoses to fuel up planes if they need to take any from us. In order to keep our machinery, our generators, and our airplanes operating, we have to keep lots of fuel at the camp. This is a fuel bladder that Ildi is sitting on. It can hold 10,000 gallons. And in order to support the research on the Thwaites Glacier, we've had up to 6 of these at one time, holding almost 57,000 gallons of jet fuel. A huge amount. We also have fuel that we store in barrels because they're relatively easy to move around. So sometimes planes will even take 1 or 2 of these barrels with them so they can land, add it to the plane, and then fly away. So they can refuel themselves even when they're away from field camp. And of course, it may snow so much that the barrels get buried under the snow. And then guess what? Somebody has to spend a day with a shovel and maybe a snowmobile digging them out. Did I mention that we do a lot of shoveling in Antarctica? Science equipment comes to the field camps packaged as cargo like this. It comes off the plane and we either tow it with a tractor or use a forklift to move it around. We unpack it, we check everything in, make sure the scientists get all of their luggage and equipment unharmed. And once in a while it gets warm enough to take your hat off, like Abby here, but not very often. We also make sure that equipment doesn't blow away or get buried in the snow. Everything has to get anchored down at field camps. You never know when a big gust of wind might come. In addition to losing things, which would be tragic if they blow away, loose items also become a real safety hazard if you have things blowing around in the wind. So we check and double check every day, make sure each item is secure. Very often, scientists need to fly to even more remote sites to conduct their research. Since a field camp acts as an airport, we help them load their supplies into the Twin Otters that will fly them from our field camp to other locations. These same Twin Otters will bring them back after they've completed their field work. Sometimes it's just a day trip. Sometimes it takes several days or even a few weeks. They might move out to another site where they camp to do their research. Can you believe that one of those snowmobiles will even fit into the airplane? This guy right here can fit inside that airplane, barely. To support research on the Thwaites Glacier, we've hosted up to 64 people at camp at one time. We've had 7 different Thwaites science groups come through and up to 4 aircraft based at our camp to fly to more remote locations. We've moved 125,000 pounds of supplies in a single season to other field camps, other field sites in the Thwaites Glacier region by small aircraft. So it makes for a very busy camp and a busy airport. We'll run the camp at peak operations for roughly the months of December and January. Then we get ready to start to take it all apart for winter. Remember, it's just temporary. It's just for the summer. So as the scientists wrap up their research, our summer field season starts to wind down. We break down the camp just the way we built it up, but in reverse. But it doesn't take nearly as long to take it down. After about 3 months of living at the field camp, we get on the last Herc and fly back to McMurdo. This is a picture of us inside of one of the Hercs, the biggest planes on skis. We're usually pretty exhausted by then. We're quite tired, but really satisfied to have been successful and proud to have been able to help scientific research work in the driest, coldest, windiest, emptiest place on Earth. By the time we leave, we're excited to head back, usually. We get to go back to hot showers and cars and phones and internet, and more importantly, our family and friends. It's a huge endeavor to conduct scientific research in Antarctica, and much of it can't be done without the support of field camps. It's also a ton of work to run a field camp in Antarctica. The people that you work and live with there become your family for a few months. You count on them every day as your coworkers, doing that really hard work, and also as your friends. So here's my field camp family. Can you find me? I'm in the green hat in the middle. In Antarctica, we learn to identify people more by their jacket and hat than their face, because their facial features are often covered up in the to protect them from the wind and snow. I try to always wear the same hat so people can find me. It's the green one. So, who wants to come work with me in Antarctica? And Sarah, I think maybe we can take some questions now.
Absolutely. Thank you, Anne. I mean, it's fascinating, because I said to Fabian this morning, who also gave us a talk about the tractors, that quite often we get talks about this from the scientists about the science and the work that's happening there, but we don't often see all the logistics behind it and getting them all set up in order to be able to do their work. So it's really good. And I had never thought about putting things in the bottom of my sleeping bag like that to just keep everything.
Yeah, it's the one safe, warm place. Yep.
Yeah. Okay, so let's go to a few questions. We had some that came in before with registration, and we've had lots that are going to come in now. I've got a question here that was sent in beforehand from Martin. He said, is there a minimum and maximum number of people to make a viable field station?
Yeah, that's a great question. There definitely is a minimum. No one goes anywhere in Antarctica unless there's another person with them. So 2 is really the very minimum number of people that can be alone in any given place. So I've run field camps before where there are just 2 of us that run the camp, and sometimes we're there by ourselves, and then other times when the scientists are there, there might be 8 or 10 or 15 of us. But that number changes as you get more and more remote. So it would be very unlikely to ever send just 2 people out to the West Antarctic by themselves. It's just too risky. It would be much better to have 3 or 4 people there at a minimum. And then maximum is just however, if you have set up a big enough camp, we usually have we have some formulas. So for instance, for every, say, 6 people, there needs to be 1 outhouse. So if you have 12 people, you'll need 2 outhouses. So you can use those numbers to scale up and say, well, we have 6 outhouses. So maybe at most we can have 35 or 40 people. But if we wanted to have more people than that, we'd have to get in more supplies.
So keeping with the number of people, or not quite the number of people, but I've got Emmeline and Juliet who are in Surrey, and Emmeline, who is 9, would like to know who is the youngest person in Antarctica. Is there a sort of bottom age that, you know, people can travel there or work there?
Well, that's a good question. As far as working there, to work in the U.S. Antarctic program, you have to be 18. However, you could, I suppose that you could be a visitor to Antarctica on a cruise ship at a much younger age.
And so Brian would like to know how noisy it is in the camp, whether the generators are always in the background day and night.
Yeah, that's a really good question. That's something that not many people think of, but yeah, it can be fairly noisy in a pretty large camp, like what we've had to support Thwaites Glacier research. So we might have generators that are 50 kilowatt generators. They're quite loud. They're loud enough that when you're up next to them, you want to have some ear protection on. And so we're usually pretty strategic in the way we line out and set up our camps so that the sleeping tents are the furthest away from a generator. And we also try not to have them be downwind so that you don't hear the generator noise at your camp. And then there's heavy machinery rumbling around. Sometimes we have to run 24-hour-a-day operations when there's big efforts going on. And so you might have to sleep with earplugs in to not hear the sound of tractors rumbling around and airplanes. But more often we're able to have a daytime shift when all of that activity happens, and then a quiet nighttime. Some of the smaller camps are able to use solar power, and that's really nice because it is quieter, but you're much more limited in how much electricity you can generate that way.
And a question that came in beforehand from Erin, who wants to know if you could invent one more thing that keeps you comfortable while working in Antarctica, what would it be?
Oh, this is a really tough one. I actually saw that question. I've been thinking a lot about it and trying to come up with something. You know, it's funny because I think there's things that have been invented. I just have never had them. And one thing that I think about sometimes is heated clothing. And I think it is available. So I wouldn't make $1 million off of patenting that, but it would be really nice sometimes to have clothing that generated its own heat so that you weren't having to constantly eat to feed your own internal fire to keep yourself warm. When you're working long days, on days when you have 3 hercs come in and you're standing out at the airport for 10 hours straight in the cold. So I might just have to get some.
Good. Okay, so I've got someone who is wondering what you would do if a person was having, you know, some medical problems or an anaphylactic shock in such a remote area. You know, because you're in the middle of nowhere.
That's right. Yeah, that's a good question. So before we can even go down to Antarctica, everyone who, whether you're a scientist or a logistics person like myself, you have to pass a medical, physical, and dental examination to make sure that that there's no underlying medical concerns that might pop up and present a problem when you're in Antarctica. And then of course that gets exacerbated as you go further afield. So when we go to the field, we have to make sure that there's always someone with some level of medical training. So at a big camp, like for Thwaites Glacier, we would have a physician's assistant with us out there. So someone with a lot of medical training. They'll bring a bunch of supplies with them, and they're the point person if anyone is not feeling well or has an accident. So we have limited supplies to be able to deal with, say, a broken limb or you know, some sort of traumatic injury. Something like an anaphylactic shock, where, you know, very often in a setting like this, that might be from a food allergy. And so when people arrive to our camp, that's one thing that we'll ask is if anyone has any severe allergies we should know about, and we'll be sure to tell the kitchen that someone's allergic to peanuts or shellfish to make sure that we let them know whenever we're serving that and make sure that there's something different for them. And then we have EpiPens staged around camp, and we also have an AED for anyone who's having severe heart issues while they're at camp. So we have some supplies, but it still is, it's, you know, we're in a remote place, so there's always a risk that comes with that.
Sure. So Tiffany would like to know what the average temperatures in the summer are when you're at camp.
Yeah, so out in the West Antarctic, supporting Thwaites Glacier, the average temperature might be around 10 degrees Fahrenheit or so, 10 or 12 degrees Fahrenheit, but it might be as cold as minus 25 Fahrenheit. So that's, let's see, so on average for Celsius, that might be 10.
10 is still below zero.
Oh yes, yeah, below zero. It won't. I think the warmest that I've seen is maybe one day that got to about zero, but generally, and that's over 3 years of being out there. So mostly it'll all be below freezing.
And so Usha, who's actually listening from Egypt, as said, so how do you stay warm inside the sleeping tent if it's that cold?
Yeah, that's a good question. We actually use 2 to 3 sleeping bags at once. So we'll have a big outer bag that we can put a sleeping bag inside of. And then there's also a fleece blanket if you'd like to use that inside of your double sleeping bag. I take 2 hot water bottles to bed with me every night. So the heaters that we have in the tents, we have big pots of water on them. So we always have hot water available. So at night you can fill up hot water bottles and bring them to bed with you. And that makes all the difference. Yeah, so having really good sleeping bags and hot water bottles, it's the ticket. It works really well.
Okay. Slightly a different question here. Simon's asked, what time zone do you use, and why would you use that time zone? You know, whose time zone or which one do you use?
Yeah, that it can be pretty tricky sometimes because we are, especially in the Thwaites project, we're working with international partners. So we have to designate one time zone to use. The US Antarctic Program in McMurdo uses New Zealand time because we fly through New Zealand and are basically due south of New Zealand. So McMurdo, South Pole, and the field camps for the US use that New Zealand time. But BASS the British Antarctic Survey uses a different time zone. So the common time zone that like all of the pilots use is UTC, or the Universal Time Zone, or Greenwich Mean Time. So that's kind of our, when we have to talk internationally, we refer to UTC time so we can all be on the same page. So you have to have lots of conversion charts near your computer, and so you know what you're talking about.
That's great. So we've got 2 kids, Ollie and Izzy from Davis in California, and they'd like to know what sort of activities you and your team do in your free time, if you have any free time in the camp.
Yeah, well, when we have lots of planes around, we tend to be very busy, but we do have times when we have downtime. And skiing is a favorite activity. So personally, I really love to ski, and we try to actually bring extra skis with us out to the field camp so that other people can ski when they have time off as well. Sometimes we do ski lessons. It's also, you know, you can just go for a walk too. The snow is actually, because it gets pretty windy, the snow can be fairly hard pack, and you can comfortably walk on it, especially on the skiway that we've groomed. And so if you wanted to just go for a walk, you could check in with me, the camp manager, ask if there's any planes scheduled. And if not, you can go for a walk on the skiway. But we've spent a lot of time playing cards, watching movies, playing games like, you know, Pictionary, or I don't know, all sorts of different games. people like to do crossword puzzles. Actually, I've found that people in Antarctica are fairly obsessed with crossword puzzles. And knitting and arts and crafts, stuff like that.
Okay. And we've got a question here. It's an anonymous person who, thank you for your presentation, but wants to know a little bit about more about how you became a camp manager and your career path.
Sure. Well, I've always been interested in science. In college, I studied biology, specifically ecology, and in doing so, I realized that I didn't really want to be a scientist, but I wanted to help. I sort of wanted to facilitate scientific discovery and make sure that it was available to the general public as well. So I kind of went into environmental education and went up to Alaska. And Alaska is a very remote place. There's far distances between towns, and I was working at a lodge that was in a remote place. So just in working there, I had to learn about how to get what we needed from point A to point B and how to be self-sufficient. We had generators, we made our own electricity, we treated our own water. And I really enjoyed that as much as I enjoyed the work of teaching people about the area. So it was a little bit of a natural transition to take those same lessons that I had learned working in Alaska to Antarctica. And I also learned about this type of logistics work through people that I met in Alaska, because the Antarctic season complements the northern Alaska summer season. So you can work in the summer in Alaska, and then as that summer finishes up, the Antarctic summer is just beginning. So then you can go down to the southern hemisphere and do logistics work down there. So there's actually quite a few people in Alaska that I know who go back and forth. And so I decided that that sounded like a good thing to do, and was able to get a job my first season working as an assistant out in field camps. So I got to learn how they operate and got really into it.
That's good. And of course, there are lots of other people with lots of other jobs and skills that are there. And so Anastasia is wondering about what advice to give to someone to getting a food service job there. If there's obviously it's making meals for everyone out in Antarctica is probably very different from, having all the other things and all your supplies around you. I want to know if there's a best time to apply or other key skills.
Yeah, that's great. We always need cooks. Being in food service is a really great way to get to come down and experience working in Antarctica. There are lots of jobs in that, whether in McMurdo Station, where there's a huge kitchen to feed up to about 1,000 people a day, or out in the smaller remote field camps. So for the US Antarctic Program, there's a website that's usap.gov, and they list the different contractors who have the contract. So there's a business that runs all of the food service in Antarctica, and you apply to work through them. Very often they like people to work in McMurdo first and get a feeling for how things work in Antarctica, and then you can say, oh, I really would like to go cook in the field, and then they move people out to field camps from there. But being able to work with limited supplies, being able to turn frozen vegetables into something really delicious is a great skill to have. And also baking, because you don't need to have many fresh goods to make delicious baked items, and they're a great way to make people very happy in the field. So that's my recommendation.
Thank you. So we've got a lady, Fiona from Caerphilly in Wales, who wants to know, when you go to a field camp, do you have a weight or volume of personal belongings that you can take? Is there a limit to them?
Yeah, we do take some personal things to the field, and there's very much a limit on how much we can take, at least at at any given time. So that first flight that I talked about, where you fly in a twin otter, maybe it's just 3 or 4 or 5 people, and you have to take some really necessary supplies, you might be just limited to a very small bag, just a few kilos of personal items. You're just going to wear the same clothes every day. So you just don't even really need to worry about changes of clothes. You need to certainly have enough to be warm, but we all wear the same thing every day. And then as more flights come in, then you can get the rest of your items. So you stage them in McMurdo to come on a later flight. But yeah, we have to pack really carefully. So when you first fly in, maybe you can bring 10 kilos or 20 pounds of your own personal stuff with you.
Okay. And there are a couple of questions here. They're both a similar question. They'd like to know what's the scariest thing that's ever happened on camp? If you've had a scary experience or any other emergencies.
Yeah, we did one time have a medical emergency where someone broke their leg at camp. And that was a pretty scary experience because this person needed to be medevaced out of camp. And the weather is such that being out in the West Antarctic, you can go for weeks without being able to get a plane in. I've had up to 3 weeks with no planes before. And so during those periods, you're always very aware of the fact that if you had a medical emergency and you needed to get someone out of camp, it might not be possible. Fortunately, when this man broke his leg, we were able to, it was nice weather at camp. We were able to quickly call into the medical clinic in McMurdo and tell them what was going on. And they were able to redirect a plane that was set to go someplace else. It hadn't taken off yet. And they said, a change of plans, you're going to the West Antarctic instead, to the field camp there to pick up a patient. And he was able to get on a plane that same day and fly back to McMurdo, where it was determined that he would need to go all the way back to New Zealand for definitive medical care. And he was able to fly out, I think later that night or the next morning. And so within 48 hours, he was back in New Zealand. And that was the absolute best case scenario. Nothing better could have happened in that scenario. And so when you think 48 hours to get to a real hospital under the best of circumstances, it gives you some real perspective. So that's why we say slow is smooth and smooth is fast. We just are very, very careful with everything we do.
Yeah. And obviously you've talked about having a few sort of medical people there, but Ben has asked if you have any dentists there as well.
So at field camp, no dentist. Nope. You have to get all of your dental work taken care of before you can even come down to Antarctica, and you have to get a dentist check off to say that you're unlikely to have any issues come up. But if we actually did have someone broke their tooth at camp one year, and she had to fly back to McMurdo, and I think she was able to get it taken care of at the clinic in McMurdo, even though there wasn't a real dentist there. But she might have even had to go all the way back to New Zealand. So medical, same thing with dental work. It's a big deal. Yeah.
And Larry and a couple of people have actually asked if you're speaking to us from Antarctica right now.
Yeah, of course. No, I'm not.
We did have someone earlier today, though, from McMurdo, so you can check out his presentation. That was Fabian, but Anne, unfortunately, is not with us from Antarctica today.
Yeah, so because of the COVID situation, there's far less field camp activity happening this year. There's just a lot less research going on in Antarctica. And so this year is my year to get to spend the northern winter back in the States and see some family instead. So this was really fun because I got to take a little trip back to Antarctica, and into all the stuff that I'm normally doing this time of year.
And I think actually we've run out of time. We've got to the top of our hour, Anne, already. So thank you. I'm sorry to everyone we couldn't get through all the questions. It's been like that all week. We've had so many questions and so many people interested, and which is fantastic. But and please, keep sending questions. I'm sure somehow we can, filter them through to the right people and get you answers, perhaps somewhere along the line. Or go to the thwaitesglacier.org website, and there's so much information, educational resources there, and everything as well. So thank you, Anne, for joining us. And
thank you so much. And thanks for putting on this great week. It's so fun seeing all the different talks.
Yeah. And take care, everyone.
Bye, everyone.